We will get started. I'll give you a few minutes just to gravitate back towards your seats. As you can see, it took us a few minutes to move the bankers off and to move the regulators on. I guess that's the do-si-do we've been facing in the markets over the last few years anyway. Okay, great. So let's get started. One more session this afternoon as we heard about the debate amongst regulation when it comes to the bankers. We know that there is a certain group that is a little bit of spring in their step these days, and that is definitely the regulators, talking about compliance, etc. in the industry. So we have a group of specialists to come and talk to us today about this very topic. How do we balance within our institutions so that regulation is not a complete takeover, something we've been hearing about in our earlier session? Well, our panel chairperson today is Lee Chuan Tek, Assistant Managing Director of Capital Markets at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And our panel members include, hark, a woman, Belinda Gibson, Deputy Chairwoman of the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. Daryl Ho is Head of Market Development for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And Masamichi Komo is Vice Commissioner for International Affairs, Financial Services Authority of Japan. Stuart Macbeth, President, CEO, Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation Derivatives. And last but not least, Stephen O'Connor, Managing Director, Morgan Stanley, and Chairman of the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. Over to you.
Okay. Hello. Is it okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Good. Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me thank ACI.
It's not working.
It's not working. Hello? It's not working.
It's mine working.
I'm not very good at sign language, so it's not going to work if I sign for you. Can I ask our audio desk to please check the audio levels?
He's giving you the thumbs up now. Why don't you try again?
Hello. Testing? Yep. Good? Good?
There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First, let me thank the ACI for inviting me to be on this panel, together with 5 very distinguished panelists. The topic we have been assigned to speak on is balancing the needs for safety and functionality in regulations. This is a theme that can be applied to any financial regulations that emerge after the crisis, whether it's capital rules or liquidity rules, regulations on markets, and more recently, regulations on financial benchmarks. The panelists and I have chosen to speak on one topic, OTC derivatives regulations. We have chosen this topic for 2 reasons. First, it is timely. I think many of you are aware that starting this week, the US is mandating clearing for credit index swaps and interest rate swaps. Shortly, a couple of weeks ago, they started mandating reporting. And of course, Japan is ahead of everyone else. It started in November last year. And shortly after, the rest of this year, the other large markets will follow suit: Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore. So it's a timely topic for us to talk about. The second reason why we have chosen this topic is really because it is an extremely tricky and challenging topic. It is tricky because the balancing of safety and functionality occurs not just at one level, but 2 levels. Let me explain. At one level, there is the usual trade-off between safety and functionality that emerges from any financial regulations. So in this case, if we mandate clearing and if we mandate reporting, it will make the system safer by reducing systemic risks arising from major defaults. But at the same time, we must also ensure that there is adequate infrastructure like CCPs and TRs to support the regulations. If not, it will have an impact on functionality. So that's the straightforward trade-off, if you like. And in crafting the regulations for each jurisdiction and in planning the implementation of these regulations, that is very much at the back of our minds. The next level of trade-off is a little bit more complex. The OTC derivatives OTC derivatives market is a global market. So for us to have the safety and functionality benefits at the global level to be fully derived, we need globally consistent rules, if not identical rules. If not, cross-border trades will be impacted. But at the same time, all of us know that not all markets are equal. Different markets in different jurisdictions have different levels of liquidity, at different stages of development, and other idiosyncrasies. So if you apply the same rules on all markets, you may attain safety and functionality at the global level, but you compromise it at the local level. So what should we do to try and strike a compromise, strike a balance between international needs and global needs? So those are the difficult issues that crafting of OTC derivatives regulations encounter. I'm very happy that I have 5 distinguished panelists who will help me answer those questions. The way we have organized ourselves is that Stephen will try to talk a little bit about the US regulations. Stuart will follow up with the European regulations. And then Daryl and Belinda will be talking about how they will take into considerations all those issues in crafting the regulations for Hong Kong and Australia respectively. And finally, we have Masa, who is the chair of IOSCO, and therefore at the heart of a lot of international coordination of regulatory policies. And he will explain how we try to attain an international consistent approach to OTC derivatives regulations. So without further delay, let me hand over to our very first speaker, Stephen. Please, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. The US is pushing forward, as you all know, on a very broad agenda of regulatory reform. And I think before I get into specifics about the US, it's probably worth pointing out that ISDA has been working with regulators to a very great extent for a number of years now, since the good news for the market is that efforts typically to improve systemic resiliency generally are good for the market and improve liquidity also. So there's a great deal of alignment between regulators and industry on so many levels. And some good examples of that are reporting and clearing, which were the 2 examples given that have come into effect, at least partly in the US at the moment. So with regard to clearing, I think certainly the inter-dealer market has embraced clearing for over 10 years now. And that was a sort of industry-driven rather than a regulatory push, in the sense that in the interbank interest rate swap market, it was clear that there were many, many benefits of clearing, such as reduced counterparty risk, reduced operational risk, reduced operational cost, reduced capital, and so on. And I think pre-crisis, more than 80% of inter-dealer interest rate swap activity amongst members of LCH, for instance, was already cleared, which as a person whose job it was to manage the Lehman default, I can tell you it was much better having trades in the clearinghouse than having trades in the bilateral account. So clearing, and it's also being embraced by clients. So there's some very large institutions out there on the buy side that have been clearing for some time now, so ahead of mandates as well. Has been mentioned, what has happened in the States this week is that the first mandatory phase 1 date happened on Monday. where active hedge funds and dealers are required to clear. And what that means is that unless you have set up a clearing arrangement with a clearing broker, you're not allowed to trade in these markets. It's as simple as that. That's against the law. So from a firm perspective where we've been offering clearing services to clients, as you can imagine, there was quite a rush up until the last minute. But having said that, the writing has been on the wall for so long, number one. And number two is that these economic benefits of clearing are still valid, that people had taken the time to invest in setting up their clearing relationships, their clearing systems, etc., quite a long time ago. So it's only a few stragglers really were caught by surprise. And it's been, as you can imagine, all of the big firms want to offer clearing services, so those clients, it was impossible for them to fall asleep at the wheel, basically, because every 10 minutes they would have had somebody knocking on the door trying to offer clearing services. So clearing, there'll be a few hiccups you'll read about, but in general, I think the market was ready, and that phase one will be okay, and the subsequent phases, I think, will be okay, except that there are many, many more funds that will be captured in the next rollout in 3 months' time. So that's a work in progress. The reporting, I'll leave most of that to my colleague here, Stuart. ISDA and member firms have equally embraced reporting, because we think that the industry, and I'm going to mention a concern I have in a minute, but each member of the industry that is involved with DTCC and has been working with regulators has embraced the reporting as well. And the reason for that is that we have a unique opportunity here, in the sense that in no other financial market anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, has there been an opportunity to get a database of all transactions in one place and allow regulators to go in and you should imagine this as a giant spreadsheet that regulators could sort by any column or type of trade, type of counterparty, notional size, and extract very valuable information. Now, the concern I have is proliferation of trade repositories. That tool becomes far less valuable if there are multiple repositories in multiple countries, or even multiple within a country. And we are seeing a bit of that, and I think it would be an opportunity lost, because people talk about an aggregation system that might be layered on top of multiple trade repositories. I'll ask Stuart what he thinks about it, but to my mind, from an implementation perspective, that's almost impossible, and the opportunity will have been lost. Just before I turn over to Stuart, I'll just flag two other areas of concern that I have. One is, has been mentioned already, that's international consistency, and which is particularly important, I think, in the developed markets. And in particular, it's very important that there will be consistency between US and Europe, for instance. We haven't got that at the moment. There is a healthy dialogue taking place now that wasn't really there before, to work towards achieving harmonization, but there are still many tensions between the US and Europe, and to some degree caused by the law in the US, the Dodd-Frank law, so the regulators' hands are tied. But if that leads to inconsistencies in treatment of products or treatment of entities, then business might begin to migrate from one region to another. Parties between regions might not want to trade with each other, and we're already seeing that. We have done for some time with the I think the US is unique in having a swap dealer registration requirement. You all will be very familiar with the fact that if a non-US bank trades above a certain amount of swaps, then it has to register with the CFTC. And that has caused many non-US banks to stop trading with US banks and even to stop trading with their US clients. So that's an example where international lack of harmonization has caused an impact on liquidity. So on this theme of balancing safety and soundness with functionality and liquidity, inconsistencies internationally will affect that, the outcome there. And finally, initial margin for uncleared swaps is another area where safety can impact liquidity. And what I mean by that is that if the outcome of the margin rules is such that the margin is so high that it harms liquidity in markets, then certainly the safety will be checked off. That was fantastic. However, it will be at the expense of liquidity in markets, and some of these markets are very important, like the cross-currency swap market, like the interest rate option market, like the inflation swap market, and so on. Many, many markets will have a core of products or some products that just can't be cleared because they're not suited to being cleared. And as we all know, the clearing houses now are the most important systemic institutions, and to put them at risk with products that are not suited to clearing, that are too risky or lack transparency or don't have the liquidity that the clearinghouse will need to access following a member default, then that would be a bad outcome. We welcome the second round of feedback requested from IOSCO BCBS, and is just busy writing a letter that will hopefully be ready by Friday. So that I'd finish with my two biggest concerns in this balance would be extraterritorial rule application and initial margin for uncleared swaps.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Stuart, you want to give us perspective from Europe?
Thanks, Chantek. Yeah, so, and thanks to the ACI for the invitation here today. So I wanted to talk about Europe, and obviously I'm an infrastructure provider, so in general they're vehicles that are able to grow their business in light of these reforms in the OTC derivative space. So potentially a different perspective both from region and from speaker. So about Europe, there are a couple of things that I think have been very good in general is it doesn't feel to have been overly politicized in terms of the outcome in Europe. And not to say that it isn't, on the way, but I think one of the big concerns was that there would be a series of national interests within Europe that fed into the regulation, and as a whole, the collective result would have been somewhat distorted. And I don't really think that's happened. I think that it's been fairly principle-based and driven through. It stayed to the remit largely that was set by the G20 Pittsburgh Agreement, focusing clearing, reporting, and then into the execution layer, although that's not yet fully legislated for. There is some politics in it. There's a little bit of UK v Germany in open access versus vertical exchange models. There's a lot of politics towards the US, I would say, particularly from the MEP group that comes in and wants to give defenses in a way against some of the extraterritorial reach of the US rules. And then there's some embedded location policy elements that maybe aren't so transparent, but they're definitely there. They're there around the trade reporting requirement as a very clear example of that, where to actually provide the service from offshore, there needs to be some sort of international data sharing agreement that doesn't exist and nobody's working on. So, very clearly as an infrastructure provider, you have to be in location, otherwise you can't fulfill the mandate in Europe. So, and they're a little bit buried because superficially there's a way in for foreign providers, but when you actually read the details, some of the foundation steps aren't actually there. The other thing that's going on in Europe that I think has been good, although there is a bad to this, is they're taking their time. I think they've, the fact that they've got a sequential series of rulemaking has meant they've managed to manage some of the controversy in the rulemaking process. So by starting, potentially with the reporting obligation and the clearing obligation, and having heard Steve talk to the fact that there isn't so much of a dispute with the industry over that. In fact, there's positive support for that. They're making progress, and some of the other things have been kicked down the road a little bit. Having said that, there's problems in that because people are living a longer time in a period of uncertainty, without finality, and they're not sure about the cumulative impact on their businesses of all the rules that will eventually arise. But I think it's been a good process to date. I think there's still a long way to go in Europe. Steve actually talked to some of the points that things like pension funds, how they're going to deal with clearing with those, have been kind of pushed down the road. Bilateral margin, they've taken a little bit more time over the actual finer points. So there's still some big questions to come in Europe. And if you look at where we are right now, we have simply dealt with the reporting requirement and the clearing requirement as an outcome. CCPs are now looking at these. I think the things they're finding new are some of the liquidity requirements. They haven't really faced those in the same way before or dealt with them. And they're stretching in across from OTC derivatives into other products as well. But the two cover for the largest default, the concentration to single liquidity providers. Client clearing is actually an issue for them. So segregation and portability, suddenly they're really having to understand who the clients are when previously they really only knew the clearing members, the clearing brokers. And then there's some concern amongst the CCPs, I think, about the margin rules, maybe less so in the OTC derivative space, but potentially the two-day margin in other products that they feel may be less competitive. And also there's the 99.5% confidence interval for derivatives. So there's a few things that are already there in the detail that are certainly making the CCPs look. There's probably less from a trade repository space. The hardest thing is data sharing, which is the whole purpose, actually. Again, this need for these international agreements and the lack of them really does mean that as a reform measure, there's a long way to go. So the data's being captured. Potentially it can be consumed by regulators within Europe, but there's no real framework to get it outside right now. And I think firms need the finer points of the detail, right, to really understand the end impacts of the reform. And then we have MiFID and MiFIR to come. That looks like that's going backwards. I think it's now potentially a 2016 item that will cover execution issues, pre-trade transparency issues, and some of the market structure issues to do with access to some of the infrastructures, and obviously what really an organised trading facility is. So still a lot of work to do in Europe, but I think so far it's been a fairly successful process in terms of balancing safety and functionality. I guess to end with, right, the uncertainty elements about the future are there, and that's a drain. And again, the extraterritorial impacts, and there isn't yet strong signs of dealing with the conflicts between different rules from different regions that are either applied externally to their country or impact cross-border trading.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Stuart. Can we have Daryl share with us Hong Kong's thinking behind its regulations?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. afternoon, everyone. Thanks to ACI and thanks to Shintup for inviting the HKMA to join this panel. I do have a canned presentation, but I'm planning not to walk through every single slide. So I would just want to highlight some of the points that are relevant to the panel discussion session today. Today we are given the topic of going through our own OTC derivatives market reform in our own jurisdictions and highlighting the elements in balancing the needs for safety and functionality. And when the panel is given this topic, we are actually working under an assumption of that there's a trade-off between safety and functionality. That always reminds me one very interesting analogy about reforming the OTC derivatives market. It's like asking the car owners to purchase insurance policies. Let's imagine in a world that we do not require car owners to purchase insurance policies. Only people doing self-insurance, or some people for the charity, they may purchase insurance for the cars. And of course when accidents happen, losses are incurred. And then after a while, the authorities thought, it could be useful to compulsorily requiring people to purchase car insurance in order to make the world safer. So the motivation of the reform is basically to ask people, okay, every single car owner, please purchase an insurance policy. Now the challenge is that, whether the insurance policy is Do I need to start over again? Anyway, I was just talking about the analogy of mandating people to purchase insurance policy, mandating car owners to purchase insurance policy. The whole motivation of OTC derivatives market reform is trying to consider the externality, the external costs created by the users of this market. And therefore, by asking people to purchase insurance policy, we hope to make the world a safer world. Of course, the question is whether the insurance policy, the price of the insurance policy are excessive, such that no one would be willing to own a car, no one will be driving the cars. So the issue of functionality kicks in, whether we can still maintain an efficient traffic system, so on and so forth. So Stephen just mentioned a point, in your part, saying that in the safest world, that is a world without any OTC derivatives market, right? Because you don't make transactions. That would be a safer world. No one driving on the road. There will be no accident. But of course, there is a certain functions the market supposed to serve, right? There are people genuinely that they have risks that they have to manage, and the financial institutions are trying to provide that service to the end users of the market. So first of all, if the reform is implemented in a sensible way, then the world will be a safer world. So I would say that if we can actually make the world safer, safety is actually part of the functionality. So that's the first point I would like to make. But when implementing the reform in the real world, we also have to consider the second factor, which is about whether the measures put in place are proportionate to the risks incurred in the activities. We have talked so much about the nitty-gritties of the OTC derivatives reform, and one of the mandatory requirements proposed by G20 is to have trading requirement that the OTC derivatives products would have to be traded on organized trading platform or electronic trading platform. But if you look into some of the Asian markets, for example, like Hong Kong, some of the products, we may have 5 to 10 transactions a day. The original motivation of having trading requirement is to promote the price transparency, the price discovery process. But in the smaller markets, such as maybe Hong Kong and Singapore, or even in Australia, in some of the product classes, if we do not have that kind of liquidity, how can we enforce this sort of trading requirement? So I think when the Asian regulators are implementing the reforms in their own jurisdictions, one dimension that they have to take into account is about whether the measures are proportionate to the risks incurred in the activities of the market. And taking trading requirement as an example, in the case of Hong Kong, although we will actually include the trading requirement in our primary legislation, when introducing the regime, but we will not be making rules for the time being. We really have to look into each and every product classes and see, whether it is appropriate to introduce the requirement. And when time is right, then we can actually make the relevant rules. So the second dimension that I would like to highlight here, when balancing the need of safety and functionality, is about proportionality. Whether what we are doing is proportionate to the risks. And the third one is about the needs to comply with international standard with a view to facilitating cross-border activities. We all know that OTC derivatives market is a highly globalized market. Hong Kong, Singapore, we are small open economies. A lot of our market participants are in international banks. So it often is the case that there are transactions taking place between one, for example, US institution with a Singaporean institution or a Hong Kong institution. So whenever there is a cross-border transaction, there's a question of what regulations would be applicable to that particular transaction, when we're talking about clearing requirement, for example. So inevitably, there will be overlapping of regulations. There could potentially be conflicts, in regulations coming from different jurisdictions. So it is very, very important that we have to work under the same international standard to ensure that this sort of cross-border activities can continue to take place. Obviously, if there are conflicting requirements, then the cross-border activities would not be possible, and then you would have a segregation of liquidity, from one market to another. And I think this is quite critical to Asia, because Asia is a relatively small player in the whole global market, but yet we are a user of the market. So if we are actually not able to provide a regulatory environment such that our institutions can continue to conduct transactions with institutions in the rest of the world, then that could be a major problem to us. So the compliance to international standard with a view to facilitating cross-border activities is very important. So in the case of Hong Kong, what we try to, when considering this particular dimension, in the case of Hong Kong, for example, we do not have a locational requirement on clearing. Although I understand the Hong Kong Exchange is about to launch its own CCP, we are not saying that all Hong Kong transactions would have to be cleared in the Hong Kong CCP. We are ready to recognize the other CCPs that are able to comply with international standards and regulated by competent regulators. That is coming from the motivation that we would like to continue to facilitate cross-border activities. And the last point I would like to make about when making the regulations in Hong Kong is to take into account of our local market conditions and characteristics. In the US, for example, the priority is to incorporate some of the products such as credit derivatives into the new regime. But in Asia, credit derivatives is not the most important part of our market. It's really the things like FX derivatives, interest rate swaps, as well as NDF. These are really the products most actively traded in Asia. So when implementing the reform in Hong Kong, although we do have the primary legislation empowering the regulators to impose requirements on institutions when trading OTC derivatives. But initially, we only plan to make rules to mandate the clearing of interest rate swaps, standardized interest rate swaps, as well as NDF. And at this stage, we still haven't had a concrete timetable when to introduce other mandatory, introduce this mandatory requirement on the other product classes. But of course, when deciding what's first, we really have to review our own market characteristics, our own market conditions to decide what's first. So in the case of Hong Kong, it would be interest rate swaps and NDF alike. Now, these are really the four principles that we would we have in mind when putting together our regulatory framework. Before handing over to our colleagues in Australia, I would also like to highlight two major challenges facing us as an Asia regulator. The first is, of course, the potentially conflicting and overlapping regulatory regime. And obviously, since the majority of institutions in this part of the world are either from the US or from Europe, and these institutions are also subject to their home jurisdiction's regulatory requirements. So there's a question, whether we can provide an environment where these institutions can continue to participate in our market. And I think we are working under a rather binding constraint because a lot of the laws have already been made in these two major jurisdictions, and when designing our own regime, we have to take into account how they are going to treat these cross-border transactions with Asia. So I think this is one really big one big challenge that we need to tackle, and that can only be tackled with international coordination, international cooperation. We cannot do it ourselves, by one single jurisdiction. And the second challenge facing us really would be the legal hurdles. Because the highest priority, as set out by the Financial Stability Board, is to actually implement the reporting regime as quickly as possible. And in some of the jurisdictions, because I've just mentioned a lot of these activities are cross-border, and you may also need to report certain transactions to overseas trade repository. So there's a question whether the legal environment in individual jurisdictions will permit this sort of reporting to an overseas trade repository. And we understand that there are certain jurisdictions have, for example, they have a bank secrecy requirement. They have certain banks may have certain confidentiality obligations that they need to fulfill, making life really difficult, for the institutions when reporting to an overseas trade repository. So I think those legal hurdles would also have to be ironed out. I better stop here and pass it over to my Australian colleague.
Thanks, Daryl. I too had some slides, but I think we'll pass them by. We've covered some of the area there. Thank you, ACI, for the invitation to come here today and to tell you what we're doing in Australia. We are advancing steadily towards meeting our G20 commitments for OTC trading and clearing. And today we issued our consultation paper for trade repository licensing. I expect that we will deal with the reporting to the licensed entities towards the end of this month. I thought Daryl's presentation was very good about what the relevant criteria are for Hong Kong, and very much the same for us. We're very explicit in our approach to regulation that we need to balance the cost of compliance, if you like, that sort of code for functionality, or perhaps functionality is a code for cost, against the regulatory benefit. And the regulatory benefit in this instance in the OTC market is a number. The first would be transparency, the ability for us and indeed for other market participants to see exposures in an aggregated manner is of enormous benefit, and that should lead to a greater comfort as to stability of the trading systems that operate globally. And the third element that we are, those, if you like, go to the quality of the market, and the other one we are concerned with is integrity, that these markets are capable of manipulation, and there was certainly talk of that in 2007. They are also capable of insider trading, and we're very keen to make sure that doesn't happen. I agree with Darryl that cross-border is the challenge for all of us, and Mass is going to tell us how he's solved that. But it is, for us, we have found great benefit working with Tech in Singapore and with Darryl in Hong Kong as the three smaller regional economies, Japan way ahead of us, in how we assist our banks to work within the US and the European regimes that are to some degree ahead of us. We are very keen for international participation in our regulatory system, that the OTC market, we don't see any merit in particular of having a solely domestic requirement for either reporting or clearing. There's room for debate about how much presence they need to be onshore, that we're working through. As I said, in Australia, our focus at the moment, in the short term, is on the reporting mandate. By the end of this month, we will have consultation papers in play that are talking about. I wasn't going to use that. I'll just talk to it. We are talking about the functionality issues, seeking your input and Australian colleagues' input on cost of access, capacity to access, and what the right level of security needs to be. We at ASIC are doing this in conjunction with our prudential regulator, APRA, with the Reserve Bank, which has of course got the overall stability function, and with Treasury, which is the policy setter for the government. Our approach, we started with a survey, and we're renewing this survey this year. The regulators together decided that we needed to find out where the market was and therefore make some recommendations. The conclusions really were that we should proceed with trade reporting as soon as possible. Clearing, we don't yet see a case for mandating clearing, because it's our expectation that the major Australian entities and the entities operating in Australia, which is essentially the large global investment banks, will be clearing in any event to meet US and European requirements. And we're certainly not recommending mandatory execution for trading of OTC, with the same considerations Darryl mentioned. At what point is the market large enough to accommodate the pre-trade transparency that goes with that? I don't plan to talk much about the margining we're working with a number of authorities about that. I think everyone realises the drama of over-margining as the economies are starting to grow again, in order to better secure the position. Work in progress. We now have legislation in place that lets things go forward, and Treasury issued a consultation paper just before Christmas, God bless them. The thing to note there, I think, to contemplate, that they would think, and we think that trade reporting licences would be issued by mid this year. Mid is sort of ending about August, September, I think. And the reporting requirements, we were envisaging mandating some reporting by the end of the year, assuming we've got licensees up and running. It's true to say that our focus is very much on interest rate swaps, credit default swaps to second order, and foreign exchange third order. We'd be looking at the smaller financial institutions that are operating in Australia, or on the relevant instruments being required to report by middle of next year, and other entities by the end of next year. And of course, the consultation on that for reporting will go into, should there be any de minimis thresholds, both in terms of transaction size and overall participation in the market before reporting should chime in. And that's a matter that Europe and the US have been debating for a time. Very briefly, the trade repository licensing paper, the key issues there that we are focusing on, the functionality really is going to be what sort of data aggregation and reporting is going to be required, and by that I mean public reporting. It's very important to industry participants because of A, what they have to plug in, and B, what there is visibility of, and C, what their client arrangements are. The terms of access, we're very keen to make sure that everyone who has to get in can get in, that it's objective entry and non-discriminatory. The big safety issue, which perhaps is functionality because it's important to you too, is that it can't be accessed unlawfully, that confidentiality is maintained and that security is maintained from a cyber attack at the most extreme, I suppose, or perhaps less attack, but just intrusion. The degree of access for us is important to understand, and the big question that I think regulators are still to grapple with fully, and we need to do it cross-border, and we need to do it, in our case, between regulators certainly, is what do you do with the information when it's there? That there is an enormous, great amount of information, and how are we going to go about looking at it? How are we going to go about assembling it and working out what's of merit anywhere in the regulatory world? You have more data than you can properly analyse, and you do a risk-based assessment to work out where you focus, and it's going to be no different for any of these regulators with the wealth of data in those repositories. As I say, the transaction reporting document will be coming out shortly. The matters for discussion there will be who needs to input. I expect that we will be recommending both sides input to an OTC transaction. If you have an obligation and the other counterparty has an obligation, both will need to report rather than just one, but we'll be consulting on that. As I said, the question of when parties have to start putting in which category and whether they're a de minimis. There'll be a question about data fields. We would be looking to take pretty much most of what the major global operations require. The question is there some more that we feel we need or others feel that we should have? Electronic format to enable access and whether you should regulate that is something we've dealt with in supervision. And then timing of reporting. In terms of clearing, we'll be starting an assessment, another market assessment shortly to find out just how much of the Australian market is already clearing in order to comply with the US rules. Europe is some time away, and we'll be closer to making a recommendation to the government about those issues. I might, on that note, hand over to Masa to hear about the global coordination.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's my great honor and pleasure to be here, and really this is an important topic, very timely also. I'll try to be brief, but in contrast to my previous speakers, I might just use a couple of my slides, so thank you very much. First, of course, I have a dual role here. That is, I represent the Japanese financial and market regulator, JFSA, and in that capacity, of course, we have been working hard to meet our G20 commitments, and by the way, the G20 commitment is here. I hope you can see it. And we were rather beyond our intention, one of the few front runners in this area by now. But then that has really caused many difficult issues for us. And this is very much due to the fact, and as previous speakers have referred to, difficulties in international coordination, and particularly with our major trading partners, in the US and in Europe. I have another hat, which is board chair of IOSCO for the past year, but counting from my earlier days as vice chair of the technical committee and then chair of the technical committee, I've been in this area for more than 3 years by now. So in fact, I should be taking all the fire from the previous speakers, also trying to defend what we've been doing. But what I would like to do is not to try to defend everything that we've been doing. I think there have been serious problems with many of the important issues. Try to be honest with you in perhaps making it clearer where we made a lot of progress and where we have lack of progress or much more work to do. And just if you could look at the G20 commitment here, this is really a certain package that all standardized OTC derivative contracts should be traded on exchanges or electronic trading platforms where appropriate, cleared through central counterparties, and OTC derivatives contracts should be reported to trade repositories. And of course, we are now in the phase of implementation. I won't go through the other slides really, but it's just that IOSCO has been doing a lot of work in developing standards that are required in the process of first designing the legal frameworks in countries and then assist in implementation of those rules. And so there has been a report on trading of derivatives, OTC derivatives, and then there have been a report on data reporting and aggregation requirements, requirements for mandatory clearing, international standards for intermediary regulation. And there is a body called CPSS IOSCO, which is a joint project with the BIS Committee on Payments and Settlement Systems, where we've developed what we call the PFMIs, or the Principles for FMIs, disclosure framework and assessment methodology. And one important issue is recovery and resolution of FMIs, FMIs being financial market infrastructures. Authorities' access to trade repository data, and while not all of those reports are completed yet, we have been making progress. Now, all this work, of course, is with the purpose of enhancing transparency, mitigating systemic risk, and preventing market abuse. So in that sense, the fact that we have been collectively working on those standards internationally can do probably objectively and in all fairness to the people doing the hard work, significant progress. But at the same time, now coming back to this commitment, are we there? I mean, all this was required basically by the end of last year. That is, end 2012 was the goal basically for G20 countries to actually achieve those objectives through legislation and then implementation. But in our upcoming report on implementation assessment or assessment of implementation of those commitments, we will have to admit that full accomplishment has not been achieved by end 2012. In many of the largest jurisdictions, the legal frameworks are in place, but implementation is still down the road. Well, the US, fortunately, is coming in very soon, but from our side, in my country at least, actually this is described in the last slide, maybe I should jump to that. We've already started implementing, and in the course of this, of course, there is a very difficult issue of how to avoid inconsistencies, even outright conflicts of our rules, as opposed to US and EU rules, without enough or sufficient coordination, without transparency with regard to the rules being implemented by our major trading partners. And that has been a very difficult problem for us in Japan. Now, at IOSCO, of course, we have to come to terms with certain aspects, but I must also say that there is a limit to what a very large multilateral organization such as IOSCO could do when it comes to the real implementation on the ground. And the devil is in the details. There are some rules which in different countries take different forms, and they are certainly designed to achieve the same objective, and they are also capable of attaining that objective. But since they are different, and since moreover when they're implemented, they're not implemented simultaneously, they're not implemented with regard to each other, then that could cause serious issues of regulatory conflict. And so just to sum up this part, I can say that standard setting has been well advanced, I would say. We have been also making progress in addressing what we call the 4 safeguards for making progress in global central clearing, which we laid down about a year ago at the FSB. That is fair and open access to clearinghouses, cooperative oversight arrangements between authorities, recovery and resolution plans for CCPs, and other financial market infrastructures. And number 4 would be appropriate liquidity arrangements, and this part for the CCPs with close work with the central bankers. On those 4 safeguards, we made substantial progress in actually setting standards. But now, where are we less progressed, or even, sorry, I made a mistake. Where are we really lagging behind? That is this area of international coordination on cross-border issues. And I just referred to this problem of implementation schedules or the timing of implementation, but of course that is only one aspect. There are areas in which, regardless of the timing, we have simply very different rules or substantially different rules between the US and Europe. And in my country, since we have been quite cognizant of the fact that we will not be the standard setters or the de facto standard setter in this part of financial regulation. Actually, we have taken steps such as to refrain from applying our rules to cross-border transactions outright. That is, Japanese rules on central clearing and mandatory central clearing and trade reporting. All that would not initially, at least, apply to cross-border transactions. Reporting requirements will come in, but we are certainly forced to, I would say, apply a certain forbearance in terms of the difficulty of trade reporting for cross-border transactions to designated or licensed CCP in our country. So in a way, we have really been suffering from this lack of coordination. Now, there is certainly now, by now a certain body dealing with those issues, and this is described in this slide. That is, excuse me, a gathering of the leaders of market regulators of major OTC derivatives jurisdictions. And this group issued a press statement last December, operating principles and areas of exploration in the regulation of cross-border OTC derivatives market. And as it is written here, the intention of this group was to, and is still, to address important issues requiring international coordination and cooperation and to present a useful way forward. In the next slide, some elements of the work in progress are there. There is a need to reach a certain understanding on clearing determinations. That is, there should be a certain process of prior consultation amongst regulators. Then a need for an understanding on sharing of information and supervisory and enforcement cooperation. On this side, I think we are better advanced than in other areas. Third, on understanding on timing, and this has really been difficult because, of course, both in the US and Europe, they have their own timelines, which they cannot change easily. And then fourth, areas of exploration regarding the scope of regulation and recognition or substituted compliance for cross-border compliance. And well, this item D has really been the most difficult but core issue of international coordination. And it is simply a fact that although we do have this desire to rely on each other in terms of market regulation and supervision, we have limited capacity to do so. And moreover, the laws and regulations that have developed in recent years in the major jurisdictions have not simply been conducive to, or at least been as reliant as we would have liked to on foreign regulation or consistent regulation of those markets across borders. And we have to come to terms with that. And so at the moment, this group is now exploring approaches to prevent the application of conflicting rules and, of course, try to minimize the application of inconsistent and duplicative rules through such concepts as mutual recognition, substituted compliance. In some cases, such as in ours, registration categories and exemptions, meaning that we would still require registration for foreign infrastructures and market participants, but we would like to make them the conditions for such registration or the terms of such registration much less onerous for foreign players when those foreign players are well regulated by their home authorities. So we're working on that, and there is also a certain need to have a set of criteria for determining the comparability of regulatory regimes. And there again, the intention has been good, I would say, because of course Europe has now very clearly articulated mutual recognition regime. The US has introduced this concept of substituted compliance. And but with all those good intentions, I'm afraid that either the approaches are very narrow in scope or have not been consistent enough that we have yet to establish whether US rules and European rules are equivalent. And then, of course, that has very strong repercussions or implications for third countries such as ours. And we are, in Japan, trying to establish or work towards establishing equivalence with both the US and Europe. But since US and Europe are not fully in line with each other, it has been a terrible headache for us. So that is the part which needs much more work in coming to terms with. That is, when we talk about the glass being either half full or half empty, I of course try to argue in favor of more than half full. But in this particular area of cross-border coordination, I think we are still much less than half full or more than half empty, and we will have to come to terms with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Masa. We have about slightly more than 10 minutes before 4 o'clock. I would like to invite questions from the floor. Please introduce yourself and indicate to which panelist you would like to direct your question to. Maybe, yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you. My name is Brian Yap. I'm part of the ACI Singapore Organizing Committee. I'd just like to ask a question, and I think it would be, I'm not sure who on the panel will be taking this question, so I'll leave that to Chuan Teck to arrow the person to answer. I'd like to ask the distinguished panel, when they're going through the issue of regulating derivatives, as a practitioner in my previous employment, has there been an effort to look at distinguishing between simple derivatives versus complex derivatives? And I don't want to get too technical here. I want to stay with simple derivatives as something that is of a magnitude of a one order, and complex derivatives as a multi-order structure, whereby, and I'm referring to the OTC contracts. And because I listened to your panel, and I've read quite a lot as well in the press, that there seems to be a lot of dialogue on reporting versus clearing. And in particular for complex derivatives, derivatives with multiple order, where you can break it down into a function of multiple parameters versus a single parameter, I'm of the opinion that it is the reporting that is more critical to the regulator, because I think effective regulation stems from effective information, and you get effective information with effective reporting. So to get all tied up in knots about clearing, I think is a deviation of what you're trying to achieve. And getting tied up in clearing then raises all the issues that I keep hearing recurring from this panel, which are issues of cross-border compliance and trespassing on various jurisdictional confidentiality issues. But whereas if you stick to getting an accurate set of reporting, whether it's a single or a multiple or complex derivative structure, then that can then translate into standardized units of risk measure, and that can lead regulators to an understanding of the volumes that are building and where systemic risk might appear. And it's the complex OTC contracts that, if increased in volume and the reporting is not accurate, then the regulators are in a way left in the dark in terms of identifying systemic risk and the buildup of that systemic risk.
Okay, thanks, Brian. That's a very good question. Perhaps I can ask the three regulators to give us their individual perspective.
It's only that I'm closer to the mic. It makes me the first person to answer this question. You're asking about, whether reporting is more important than clearing, especially with a view, considering there are certain complex products. My understanding of the original intention of the G20 recommendation is to have mandatory clearing for standardized products. Obviously, the kind of products that can be centrally clear must be standardized enough such that the central clearing counterparty can risk manage a portfolio of different positions. So if you're talking about bespoke product, then it may not be subject to central the requirement of central clearing, but it will be subject to a more stringent margin requirement. I think the whole concept would be that we would like to motivate people to make better use or more often use of standardized products, which can be centrally clear. And if some bespoke product must be some bespoke transaction must be done, then they will be subject to a more stringent margin requirement. But of course, the question is that what are those margin requirements? Maybe I leave it for my colleagues to add.
And luckily, I'm a securities regulator, and we have separation from the prudential, which is the ones that must determine that question of the margining. I agree with you completely that there's a cost-benefit analysis to be done on both reporting and clearing for the truly complex transactions, but to the extent that they're the ones that can blow things up, then there must be some other oversight put in place. The benefit of more reporting clearly is to make others think about whether some of the more complex products can be traded. I don't have much more to add. Massa, do you have anything to add on this? Or?
Thank you very much. Well, I think you touched upon some very important issues and taken together, because, of course, there is certainly this question of how much you can standardize products, but then I don't think there's anything in the standards agreed up to now, or the rules and regulations on the ground that are intended to eliminate complex products. In fact, I think it is, of course, a certain preference for regulators to have central clearing for those products that can be standardized, and then certainly from the three objectives of embarking upon this regulatory reform in the first place: more transparency, safer systems, and prevention of market abuse. Of course, there is a certain preference attached in terms of the design of the markets for that matter. But on the other hand, in a way, this issue of transparency, of course, is not transparency for the sake of transparency, but it has to be both understandable and also useful information. Also useful in the sense that at IOSCO we have put a lot of emphasis on having a global legal entity identifier system, so that, of course, it would make it far easier to aggregate, to also make available the information to the public in useful ways, to have a common set of identifiers for each party to a transaction. And I mean, we have been, at least from our side, we think we have been making progress. Having said that, there are some issues that have very recently come to light, and you mentioned something about confidentiality issues. That question, I don't think, is insurmountable in any way. It is really up to each jurisdiction to actually have the right legal frameworks in place. And in the European Union, at least, we are waiting for the the European rules to fix that, which at the moment is considered as problems in a number of European countries. In other countries, again, at the FSB, there have been recently a survey of the rules applicable, and I think there will be certainly peer pressure from other countries to fix any legal obstacles to reporting to TRs of transaction data, and then for those TRs to be able to report to either the authorities, national authorities, or to perhaps what might be conceived as a super TR at the level of global data aggregation. Actually, I'll be very curious to hear from our colleague from the DTCC on how they see this, because it can be a certain misunderstanding on our part that things are going quite well. One issue has been, of course, that we have been aware of is, of course, the certain amount of time and cost required to actually have a viable TR in the major markets. This is still very much ongoing work, and we're certainly closely working together with the TR community to make this happen and make it a success. But can we hear from you?
Yeah, so I guess to talk to the question, you know, the repository is different from clearing. The repository is, you know, complete. It's full data in theory, subject to the fragmentation comments that, you know, we've in effect just heard, and I'll come to those. And clearing is netting multilaterally and secure margin processing, and, you know, and timely settlement of that margin. And there's other ways of achieving those sort of things with things like compression and obviously bilateral margin. So there's other processes that can give you some of those benefits that may be relevant to other derivatives that don't fit in the clearing model. So I guess I just have to see them as different. I do support reporting coming first because I think it can inform clearing, you know, and because it can allow people to understand the structure of the market. We've worked with regulators, we've worked with ISDA in trying to provide data, you know, that isn't disclosing participants' names, but gives ideas about what products are traded, you know, how liquid they are, and at some level of granularity as well to enable those discussions. And what's very important is that people have the data to have a balanced discussion, because otherwise it becomes, you know, opinions about the structure of the market and what products are traded and which aren't. And, you know, it tends to come across that the industry is pushing back probably, but they've got real concerns that the products aren't truly fungible at a more macro level that may be the initial point of the discussion. So the data's helped cut through some of the, I guess, barriers to efficient communication and really getting to the nature of the market. So, you know, we would advocate is an important part of the reform, and it actually enables some of the other steps. The fragmentation problem is a big one, and the aggregation problem is a big one, and actually the amount of data is a significant issue. So I can give you a strange stat from our US operations, which isn't the world's, but we had something like, this was a couple of weeks ago, but it was 1 week's transaction messaging into our swap data repository in the US, and we had 53 million transaction records, you know, passed into our system. And so, you know, I've seen Steve at other presentations present that 20,000 derivatives are traded a day type numbers, yet, you know, we've got 53 million records just on US data, transactional records coming into us. They might be a valuation, they might be an update to a
portfolio, an open trade, but there's a huge amount of traffic and there's a huge amount of data. The market standard language is FPML. It's a very rich data. It's actually quite difficult in a way to get the tools to analyze that data efficiently. So there's still a lot of work to do with really getting to grips with this data, and even the idea of aggregating it somewhere centrally is non-trivial. I certainly watched the first days of there's 3 SDRs in the US, and there was some public reporting, and actually the first trade I saw from CME's system come up for price reporting wouldn't have looked like it did in our it would have been 1 trade in our system. It came out as 12 from CME. So the nature of the data that's stored is very different. The aggregation problem is going to be significant. We're experiencing that single regulators find it difficult to consume our data. The idea of an aggregator trying to deal with multiple repositories, data formats on an even larger scale is actually a significant challenge.
Yes, I certainly agree. I think all of us here will probably agree that reporting is the most fundamental, the most important part of this whole reform. And yet we spend so much time deciding on what data to collect and so little time on how to analyze those data. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. Now, we are quickly running out of time. Any final questions from anyone? Yes.
Stéphane Malray, I'm at Société Générale and chair of the ACI FX committee. Quick question following the previous panel from the CEO of banks. There's 2 things who strike me between the 2 panels. The first one is still the lack of trust from banks in the industry. And the other thing they comment on is the lack of understanding of those complex instruments by regulators. So from a regulatory point of view, what do you need from us as market participants, our banks, to build back this trust or explain the complexity of our product? Because it seems that there is still a disconnect between the regulator and the banks.
Excellent question. Since we have 2 gentlemen from the private sector and 3 regulators, perhaps I can ask the 2 gentlemen, Stephen and Stuart, whether you share that same perspective, that there is a lack of trust on the part of regulators towards the private sector participants, and whether regulators themselves fully understand complex derivatives. And then the regulators can give their own perspective on this.
Thank you. From my perspective, I think immediately post-crisis, there was certainly a political and to some extent a regulatory, not backlash, but heightened focus on derivatives, including some people pointing to derivatives as being part of the reason for the crisis in the first place, which we clearly don't agree with. But my own perspective, which really I can only speak for, has been the opposite of that, in the sense that I have spent, since becoming chairman of ISDA 2 years ago, I've spent a lot of time with regulators. I've been to many countries. I'm down in Washington, as you can imagine, quite a lot, based in New York. But I've been to almost every country in Europe. I've been to Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and met then. That's at the national level, and at the more level above that, I've met with ESMA, the European Commission, IOSCO, FSB, and my own experience has been that there is a very healthy dialogue that's questioning where appropriate, but also that recognizes the value of OTC derivatives. And I think that often, you know, as we saw from the first question, that there's a laser focus on the complex, and that's not what these markets are all about. Clearly they're important. I think the question before was, is there a different approach to the simple and the complex? And I think the clearing versus non-clearing is a similar kind of boundary, in that simple stuff can generally be cleared, and the more complex is not. But I think we certainly advocate, and I think there's an understanding generally in the regulatory community, that a lot of the stuff that can't be cleared happens to be, if not equally, maybe more socially useful than the cleared stuff. So for instance, interest rate options are needed for the proper functioning of a mortgage bank. So going back to the US for a second, like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae just can't function without interest rate options to hedge their lending activities. So taking that away would be, you know, a disaster from that perspective. Pension funds need inflation swaps. Governments and corporations globally need currency swaps to access overseas capital markets. So these are very important products, and I think there is recognition of that. So my personal perspective is that there is an engagement and a willingness to enter into dialogue that improves, the further the more time people spend together working through these regulatory initiatives, the better that becomes.
I think I do see probably slightly different dynamics with different regulators in different countries, but in relationships with industry. It's not necessarily that any regulator anywhere is closed. I think they may, try to hear more voices sometimes in certain situations. More often, sometimes I think the problem is actually that the firms get very quickly into almost the edge cases and the exceptions in terms of where their concern is, and actually the common ground isn't fully recognised in the dialogue. So quite often I think people aren't really disagreeing, but the conversation can sound like that, simply because literally that piece of common ground hasn't been fully recognised in the dialogue. And actually one party's moved on to a group of exceptions or edge cases, and it tends to make the conversation feel a little bit more adversarial than actually it is. That would be my comment, so I will hand over.
Well, my recommendation to our market participants is that, if you do have issues on the proposed regulation, you are more welcome to shout. You have to let us know. We have to learn about the issues and actually take that back in a bigger context to see how your concerns could be addressed. And at least, I'm confident that, we can actually find a kind of common ground, where we actually agree and where we disagree, and that could be understood by the market as well as by the regulator. And to us, we use many working groups that engage market participants and try to sound out some of the policy ideas with them before, making them a final policy. So I guess that's the one way that we can make use of the market's input. In these days, there are actually more working groups than the number of staff members who are in charge of this project. So you can see how keen we are, in hearing what you're going to say.
Do you want us to finish, or? Be very
We
quick.
are running a bit short on time, so
Okay.
if we could wrap up quickly,
Okay.
that would be
I'll be
great.
very quick. I don't think there's a generalised lack of trust of the industry at all. I think there are always some participants that you trust less, and it's usually because there's been an event that, or an attitude to compliance or otherwise, that means that you have to be careful, because ultimately, if something happens, who's going to be called to account? It is going to be the regulator as to where were you. But by and large, I think the dialogue with industry has been excellent, and we are always open to more.
Thank you. Just 2 points. And at IOSCO, first, we are committed to improving communication with the private sector as much as we can. And so you are more than invited to provide your input to us. Second, again, at IOSCO, actually, we pushed back a G20 deadline intentionally on such issues as margin requirements by issuing a second consultation paper, because we needed more input from you. So we are making our best effort. Thank you.
And we'll leave it on that note. Belinda and gentlemen, thank you very much for an informative and international perspective. I appreciate it that it's rare to have such an international group speak to the markets. Don't go away yet. We do have some mementos for you. And here to present them is Manfred Vibogen, the president of the ACI. So please come up when your name is called. Our panel chairperson, Lee Chuan Tek. Thank you very much. Stephen O'Connor. Stuart Macbeth. Daryl Ho from my hometown of Hong Kong. Belinda Gibson. And Masamichi Kono. Thank you all very much. And let's get one group photo of regulators together. Do we have our group photo? Could you all come right here, center stage, just very quickly so we can get one great snap. We don't want gifts. We want the one woman speaker of the event. Lovely. Thank you very much. And now, a tea break for 10 minutes. Just a couple of housekeeping notes that you need to know about, however. For ACI members, you will have a general assembly after the tea break in 10 minutes here in this room. Don't forget dinner tonight. Buses picking up people at 6:30 p.m. Do wear your tag as well, the security tag, when you come along this evening. And just a reminder, if you want to win that iPad mini, be here on time tomorrow morning. Have a lovely evening.